Well, U.S. President Joe Biden, accompanied by First Lady Jill Biden and former President Barack Obama and Bill Clinton, are at Ground Zero Memorial Site in downtown Manhattan in New York to mark the 20th anniversary of the Al-Qaeda terror attacks on America. Let's cross it now to our correspondent who's in New York City, Sherwin, Bryse, Pease. Good day to you, Sherwin. Somber scenes coming out of New York where you are. Paint a picture for us. Looking from afar.
Yeah, the focus is currently on Ground Zero. You correctly mentioned that the incumbent President Joe Biden and Jill Biden, the First Lady, accompanied by former Presidents Barack Obama and Bill Clinton, they have now departed the Ground Zero site. The President is on his way to the Pentagon in Washington. Of course, the second region that suffered an attack 20 years ago, of course, the Pentagon, the Defense Department, known in other words. And then, of course, a third memorial in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, where brave passengers on a commercial jetliner that was earmarked to fly into Washington, D.C. Many suspect that it was going to hit the Capitol building, the seat of government in Washington, brought down by brave passengers in a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. But the backdrop to all this flow is that we are in the midst of a pandemic, right? Over 650,000 people in the United States have perished. Thousands of people are in ICUs and in hospital beds fighting this pandemic. So this 20th anniversary, on top of what is already a somber time for so many families in this country, is really being felt by those that are today engaged in, the events that are transpiring down in downtown Manhattan. Just coming into the office today, you do, though, get a sense that, people are also getting on with their lives. People had their golf bags out and they were off to play a round of golf this morning. There are, a generation in South Africa's contents. We talk about the born frees, right? People born in 2001, or if you were 5 years old or even 10 years old, you probably won't remember those events quite as acutely as someone like myself that lived in California at the time when these attacks took place. I was in my 20s, So there are generational affiliations, if you will, to what is happening today. And you saw the families of the victims who perished in those attacks, those Twin Tower attacks, reading the names of their loved ones, which has become a tradition over the last 20 years. Of course, you don't hear from officials, right? The president was there, but he didn't get to speak here because this is a family-focused affair. But President Biden did release a video statement from the White House last night, and this is part of what he said. Flo, let's watch.
To the families of the 2,977 people from more than 90 nations killed on September 11th, 2001 in New York City, Arlington, Virginia, and Shanksville, Pennsylvania, and the 1,000 more who were injured. America and the world commemorate you and your loved ones, the pieces of your soul. We honor all those who risked and gave their lives in the minutes, hours, months, and years afterwards. The firefighters, police officers, EMTs and construction workers, and doctors and nurses, faith leaders, service members, veterans, and all of the everyday people who gave their all to rescue, recover, and rebuild.
Yeah, we also heard from Bruce Springsteen, the icon musician, with a rendition, Flo, of I'll See You in My Dreams, and then also later a rendition of You'll Never Walk Alone. We also heard from a sister who lost her brother in the attacks, Athula Castamedes. She says that on September, the focus tends to be on September the 11th.
Yeah. It
was on September the 12th, she said, that we all realized we became members of a club that we didn't want to be part of. Of course, a recognition there of the 2,000, almost 3,000 people who died, and the families that were left with so many questions on September 12th. So many more questions than answers, Flo.
And just on that note, you've been reporting, speaking to people who remember that day and that time 20 years ago. What has stood out for you from these conversations?
Well, if you remember 2001, September the 11th was a bright blue, clear day. People were on their way to work. It was the middle of, the end of summer, if you will. I chatted to someone that wasn't perhaps right at the downtown area, but the chaos permeated the entire island of Manhattan. People, were told to go home once the first plane went into the tower because they weren't sure if there were more attacks directed at New York. There was chaos on the streets. ATMs ran out of money because people were panically withdrawing their money, trying to get home. The subway station was shut down because they weren't sure if that was infrastructure underground was going to be targeted. You couldn't get a cab. People had to walk for miles to get to their families. In addition to that, you also saw a resurgence and a surge in Islamophobia, and this is something that President Biden addressed in that speech from the White House last night. Muslims were targeted. Sikhs were targeted, anyone with a turban on their head. The lack of education about who was what and what that represented was something that Americans grappled with at that time and grapple with today, something that President Biden spoke to last night. Let's watch.
Yet we also witness the darker forces of human nature. Fear and anger, resentment and violence against Muslim Americans, true and faithful followers of a peaceful religion. We saw national unity bend. We learned that unity is the one thing that must never break. Unity is what makes us who we are. America at its best. To me, that's the central lesson of September 11th. It's that at our most vulnerable, in the push and pull of all that makes us human, in the battle for the soul of America, unity is our greatest strength. Unity doesn't mean we have to believe the same thing, but we must have a fundamental respect and faith in each other and in this nation.
A nation certainly in need of unity if you just look at the divisiveness even around wearing masks, about taking the vaccine as it relates to the COVID-19 pandemic. But going back to your question, Flo, 2001, after those attacks, the securitization of the United States, the securitization of office blocks. As camera people and journalists are seeking to interview people, you have to go through all sorts of security checks to get into any building in this country. We're based at the United Nations. The securitization of this precinct and this complex, soldiers on the streets. Life changed in America after 2001, and it's never gone back to that day. The NYPD had a slogan, if you see something, say something. That remains true to this very day, Flo.
Yeah, and just before we wrap up, Sherwin, I just, from my side, really just being nosy at this point, I do note, and I saw your tweet, they're talking about, who was arriving at Ground Zero, and it was interesting that all the living past presidents and the current president, of course, did arrive with their first ladies today at Ground Zero. One interesting absenteeism, former President Trump wasn't there. Has there been much talk about that? Was the fact that he was missing of any importance? I suppose everybody is more focused on 9/11 and those commemorations, but it did seem something noteworthy there.
Noteworthy in a sense also that he is a New Yorker, right? I mean, he was in New York during the attacks on 9/11. A former president, one would have expected him to show up among, along with his fellow former presidents and the incumbent. But we do understand that the former president, Trump, will be calling/commentating in a live pay-per-view boxing match today, which is happening down in Florida. There's a poster that I also tweeted with his image on it, talking about how he and his son Donald Trump Jr. will be commentating in this boxing match that includes, I believe, Evander Holyfield. So that's a little bit of what we know that will be on his itinerary today, Flo.
All right, thanks so very much, Sherwin. Bryse, Pease, SABC News correspondent for us in New York, where those commemorations for 9/11 are currently, in fact, taking place. All right, we continue then. We cross now to our correspondent in the UK for more on what the UK is doing in terms of commemorations today. John Bevir, good day to you. Thank you so very much for being with us this afternoon. Let's talk about the events that are taking place to commemorate the anniversary.
Yeah, sorry, I'm speaking over you and I apologise. I was just going to say that here in the UK we've been seeing some of these commemorations taking place. This is Bristol Cathedral behind me. This is one of the many places across the country where people have been asked to go and to pay their respects and remember those who died. I think, as we've just been hearing there from New York, this was an event that everyone remembers where they were at that time that it happened, and that certainly is the case in the UK as well. The UK has the link as well. 67 Britons were among the 2,977 who died, and of course Britain stood shoulder to shoulder with the United States as an ally when it came to the military answers to the questions that were asked on 9/11. Around the UK, as I say, prayers have been said, and there's also really the focus today is going to be a private memorial service that's been organised by the September 11th UK Family Support Group. That's taking place in London later. That's a private service. They're going to be lighting candles to remember the people who died and very much paying their respects 20 years on from that tragic day.
All right, so that delay wasn't your fault, John. There is some kind of a delay between you and I at this time, so we just have to wait as we talk to each other. But I've heard Prime Minister Boris Johnson talking about the 9/11 attacks, and he said that the terrorists had failed to undermine the faith of the free people. Is that the general sense in the UK? Since, you know, I believe that that fear is still sort of there in many parts of the world. In fact, one might say particularly then in the US. But it's interesting that you know, your Prime Minister Boris Johnson has said that they essentially failed to instill that fear.
Yeah, absolutely. And you need to remember as well that in the aftermath of 9/11, and because of the UK involvement in the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq, then the UK became the target for terrorist attacks. So there have been hundreds of people have died because of terrorism in the UK since 9/11, and as we were hearing from New York, it's very much the case again that life has never gone back to how it was before, that things changed on that day and they are still changed to this day. We've heard Her Majesty the Queen give a message to Joe Biden, who said that her thoughts and prayers and those of her family and the entire nation remain with the victims. She highlighted that she visited the World Trade Center site in 2010 and very much still remembers that, and what a poignant location and moment that was. And as you say, Prime Minister Boris Johnson issued a defiant message. He was very much encouraging people not to live in fear, and I think we might be able to hear from the Prime Minister and what he had to say now.
A handful of dates are etched into our collective memory, some joyous, others tragic. 20 years ago, September 11th, 2001 became, in President Roosevelt's words after Pearl Harbor, a date which will live in infamy. But while the terrorists imposed their burden of grief and suffering, and while the threat persists today, we can now say, with the perspective of 20 years, that they failed to shake our belief in freedom and democracy. They failed to drive our nations apart, or to cause us to abandon our values or to live in permanent fear. The fact that we are coming together today, in sorrow but also in faith and resolve, demonstrates the failure of terrorism and the strength of the bonds between us. Recent events in Afghanistan only strengthen our determination to remember those who are taken from us, cherish the survivors and those who still grieve, and hold fast to our belief in liberty and democracy, which will always prevail over every foe.
And John, let's talk about you know, reactions or what's being said by other senior figures in the UK. I do know that the Queen did speak to the President of the US, Biden, and said that the victims are in her prayers. Any other notable comments coming out of senior members in the UK on this, especially given, you know, Prince Harry has indeed been living in the US for quite some time now?
Yeah, we heard, as we said, from the Queen, who issued her condolences and her prayers and her thoughts of her and her family to everyone affected in this, you know, regardless of what nationality they were. What we have seen as well, interestingly, is that as well as people paying their respects to those who died, we have seen today as the jumping off point for many people talking about the foreign policy failures that have occurred after 9/11. And obviously, as we've seen, the incredible and shocking pictures that have been coming out of Afghanistan in recent weeks, and the withdrawal of troops from there and the scramble to leave Afghanistan. And we have a lot of newspapers today have been running editorials that have been saying it's a huge foreign policy failure, and they've been using this, the 20th anniversary, to highlight the point where they think things started to go wrong, and that we saw the UK joining the US in this role as a global policeman of the world, but how actually they haven't got round to doing the nation building afterwards that they need to. Some people have been highlighting that, and they're using this anniversary as a means to comment on the wider response to the 9/11 attacks. But in terms of the senior political figures, everything like that, people very much today have just been using this as a time to remember those who died.
All right, John Bevir, thank you so very much for your input then this afternoon. That is our UK correspondent, John Bevir, speaking to us there on the reaction from the UK as the world observes 9/11, the terror attacks that took place in New York City in the US.